All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I am one of the judges. I'm also a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where I teach students about sustainability and food solutions. Then I'm also a senior fellow with the Global Conservation Oceans program at Monterey Bay Aquarium. So that's where I'm coming from. And we're going to talk today about sustainability. How do we measure and implement it to create greater roads to adoption? And so I kind of wish we went on the first day, because I should have kept a little tick sheet of how many times everybody's mentioned sustainability. And one of the problems is we haven't defined it. And in fact, the chef last night came the closest to trying to define what he meant when he was talking about sustainability. So, but because it's early in the morning, because I know I'm tired, we've been full of information. So let's start with a super simple question. Is this big? What do you guys think? Is it big? Relative to what? Right, exactly. So I could have shown this picture and I could have said, well, it's the size of the moon. Yeah, it's big. But then if you're a planetary biologist, you say, oh, there's actually massive things out in the universe, and the Earth can't even show up on this because it's not even a single pixel on the page. So there's things out there that are much, much, much bigger. But if I did this and I took it the other way, I could have just said, oh, it's looking at something underneath a microscope and it's really not big. And so big is relative. And as people, when we're young, we actually learn to kind of assess what's big, and big changes over our life. When we're children, something we think is big, later on as we're adults and we have a better knowledge, we won't think is big. So we do need a reference. So when we're talking about aquaculture, feed, and we say, this is sustainable, what's our reference? Is the reference just the feed? Is it the person, and we're taking care of the person who's doing the feeding? Is it the country where that feed is taking place? Is it the species in the pen? What are we talking about? And so this is part of the problem, is that when we say, I could say this is sustainable, and somebody could say no, because according to my thinking, it's not. So we need to get terminology to be on the right page about it. And so Peter Tyedmers from Dalhousie University is going to come up, and he's going to take us through how we can actually measure impact. And we've heard a lot about life cycle assessment, but he's really going to break it down of what is a life cycle assessment. And then, okay, we're a superhero-themed movie, so most superhero movies, there's some dimensionality to them. In Buckaroo Banzai, he was dealing with the 8th dimension. Here we have another movie that's Dimension X. We don't even know what the dimension is. Well, when you talk about sustainability, what's the dimension of sustainability? And if we consider sustainable agriculture, it's multidimensional. We can take any one of these components of it and talk about how to improve sustainability in one of these little things. And just because we're working on the environment on the left-hand side, we may not be addressing health over on the right-hand side, or vice versa. And so again, it's just this never-ending story. We always need to keep increasing our definition. And so how do we kind of make sense of all of this? And again, life cycle assessment is a way that we can make sense of it. But, okay, again, we're superheroes. You don't just have superheroes without villains. You really need villains, and awesome stories have multiple villains. And in the life cycle assessment, we have a number of villains, and we're going to talk about 4 today. We're going to talk about the parser, that's only telling one side of the story, the allocator of how much of certain things are we actually taking care of, the quick pick, which is getting people to choose fast, and because of that, you choose wrong. And then you also need a villain that's just timeless. Greek mythology brought us the Hydra. You cut off the head of one head of the Hydra and another one grows back. And so it's this trade-offs, you solve one problem and you get another problem. So after Peter defines life cycle, he's going to walk through each of these villains. And so Peter's going to take it over. So welcome to the stage, Peter Tyedmers.
So clearly we've tried to be coordinated in our presentation, and the handoff was not as smooth as ideal, but thank you, Michael, for setting up and for the great suggestion that we work through the idea of villains to stay with the theme, but I'll get there in a second. Initial observations. I'm going to speak mostly about greenhouse gas emissions, but we can't lose sight of all the other challenges that we need addressing, as Michael was alluding to, and they will come up a little bit, but they all, in different ways, require attention, and we all will individually bring our different value sets to what we prioritize amongst them. Another initial observation that I have only over the last sort of 15 years become more accustomed to is many of us in this room think quite differently about things like greenhouse gas emissions. If you're in industry, you're thinking about scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, and maybe eventually worrying about how you're going to address scope 3, those things that are coming to you from your suppliers. I come from a different analytic context, which is life cycle thinking. I didn't start out using life cycle assessment. I came to it through other similar ways of quantifying our concerns. But life cycle thinking, where the focus of concern and analysis and reporting is related to a product or process that delivers very specific things. It should be clearly and well defined. And those things could be a given fish meal with certain nutritional attributes. It could be an aqua feed, again, with certain nutritional attributes, prices, etc. Or it could be a final product. And all of these are very valid bases upon which we can assess the performance, the life cycle performance of a system up to a given point in a production chain. But it really helps if we are clear about what we're trying to get done. We're very specific about the objects that we are trying to relate our concerns related to climate change to. Life cycle-like analyses can be more or less formal and more or less rigorous. And that's where we face a great deal of our contemporary challenge, because many people are generating what they call life cycle assessments, life cycle-like analyses, and they are very different in their effort, inclusion, precision, and how they are reporting things. There are also, unsurprisingly, a lot of precursor-like tools that have been developed that LCA comes from. It wasn't born de novo into the world. It is derived from a history of energy analysis, material flows analysis, but we also have things like ecological footprint analysis. We also have, if you want to think about it, daughter analytic frameworks like carbon footprinting. Carbon footprinting isn't something new if it's done well. It's actually just an extraordinarily output-specific life cycle assessment, where the only concern that is being reported on is that one set of contributions to climate change. But what makes life cycle assessment, and to a certain extent carbon footprinting, different from a lot of its precursor and still existing analytic approaches is that from the early days, it received attention by international organizations to standardize methodologies. And I've made a mistake. I've actually stacked partial PDFs of the front pages of both the ISO 14040 standard and the 14044. Those are actually two documents that I've sort of got partially represented on the right side of the slide. Those are the sort of founding ISO guidance documents for how LCA should be done, and they are at least 20 years old. It's been around for a long time. We have good guidance on how this work should be done. It tends not to get read when people are extremely enthusiastic about coming up with a number. But the ISO and the organizations that are contributing to the advancement of effort in this space have not rested. They continue to develop new and more application-specific rules. And so we have the ISO greenhouse gas carbon footprint of products requirement guidelines for quantification, and that's an ISO standard 14067. And most recently still is the carbon footprint for seafood product category rules for finfish. I'm wondering, has anyone ever heard of the ISO standard 22948? Excellent, we have 2 hands. But we've also heard a lot over the last few days about carbon footprinting and LCA and greenhouse gas impacts of products. And I fear to suggest that we've had very little sort of underpinning knowledge of what would drive a very good assessment like that. So if you're curious, you could follow this up. Unfortunately, ISO charges for accessing their standards. But ideally, you would look to something like this, and these are international standards. But for a long time already, we have had national level standards. This is the front of the British Standards Institute product availability specification, PAS 2050-2 from 12 years ago. The British Standards Institute was concerned about everybody getting on the same page when reporting greenhouse gas emissions of products, and this is specific to seafood products, and this is 12 years old. The year after, the Norwegian standards body produced their own seafood product-related life cycle assessment carbon footprinting standard, and it looks like that. We also have, soon to emerge, European-wide product category rules for seafood provisioning. So we have lots of guidance out there, and it's been around for a long time on how to do this work well. Most of the time, these standards are in agreement. Sometimes they're not quite, but most of the time they are. That's a little bit of context. I want to just give a very quick sort of high-level overview, and it will only be a couple slides. LCA is deceptively simple sounding, but in practice does take effort. And for those of you that may have invited analysts to do work for you like this, you will probably have been confronted by some of the challenges that they need to understand to help you understand your processes and the greenhouse gas and other impacts that flow from it. It's typically described as a 4-phase process. Up front, in goal and scope, you need to get clear on what you are assessing and what you are comparing. Is it and if there's no comparison being made, that's fine. But in the case of the F3 challenge, if krill meal is the standard against which you are hoping to substitute something, ideally, if you were to assess the life cycle performance of one of the alternative candidate products against krill meal, you would do a head-to-head, and you would define that the basis of a comparison on the functional value of those two products. You then need to think about what's the scope of analysis. It doesn't have to be from the cradle to raw material acquisition all the way through to final waste fates. Here in the graphic, what I've shown is insight taken from 124 published life cycle assessments of aquaculture case studies. These are not fisheries, these are not corn, these are all aquaculture. And what you see here is that all 124 did focus on the production-related activities, but a lesser group also included feed provisioning. What was missing there are probably, those were LCAs of unfed aquaculture. You see the difference between the pie that is for production-related versus the pie that is feed-related. But after that, you see far fewer studies that have gone on to include processing-related, packaging-related impacts, storage, distribution, et cetera. So you can define the point of analysis on a downstream side pretty much anywhere you want that makes sense for the comparison that you're doing or the scope of work that you're trying to undertake. You also need to think about what do you care about beyond maybe greenhouse gas emissions. Again, from 124 LCAs of aquaculture systems, every one of them included a contribution analysis to global warming potential. That's the GWP in the upper quadrant in green there. But other ones would include acidification potential. That's contributions to acid precipitation. Eutrophication potential, cumulative energy demand. So it's a useful tool for giving us insight in relation to a number of things that we are concerned about, but we don't have to include them all, and we could be very focused if we choose to. The second stage in LCAs is basically it's where all the questions get asked, lots of data get assembled, more questions get asked, and this is, I chose to, this is what I think of because I'm a university professor. When I'm doing LCA work, I'm doing with students, and this is what my grad students look like when they start out on this, and they end up looking very different after the end of it because they are tired. It's taken them far longer than they've realized, and but yeah, so this is our hopeful starting out analyst where the data will all flow and it'll become clear, and hopefully it does go easily, but it can be surprisingly challenging to get the useful information related to underlying processes. This is after all the data get collected. A really good LCA will be using some dedicated software. I've just shown you two examples here, the upper ones, CIMA-Pro or OpenLCA. CIMA-Pro is a commercial analytic framework. OpenLCA is cheaper to access, but training will cost money. And ideally, people will also pay for underlying data sets that will make the analytic process far easier for the analyst to conduct and conduct well. The world's leading background database is called EcoInvent, and I've got an image of its logo there. And ultimately, at the final stage is the interpretation where models get refined, and if need be, there's an iterative process there. We test the impact of assumptions, that we don't just take the outcomes as given, that we think about, wait a second, back here I had to make an assumption. What are the consequences of that? Does it radically change the outcome of our models? Understanding implications and addressing them. That's how it's done. That's very brief. LCAs of seafood systems have been done since 1997. The very first one was a master's thesis at Aalborg University, looking at the implications of producing pickled herring in a glass jar. Very, very specific. Since then, we've had hundreds of additional seafood system LCAs conducted. Here are some data that a couple of my students compiled. Primary studies in blue, aggregation studies, reviews in orange. And what we see over time is seafood-related LCAs have been increasing fairly rapidly amongst the thousands of other food system LCAs, some of which are incredibly important for our understanding of aquaculture systems, because why model corn production in the US de novo if there is a great set of LCAs out there to draw data from? I have no data up that I can point to because I've yet to, and I don't know if I would ever really try to quantify this, but in conversations with colleagues, LCA practicing colleagues in seafood systems and food systems more generally, I think what we see is, as societal concern with understanding the challenge and bringing hard data to bear on our understanding, we have seen an increasing occurrence of really poor work getting into the literature. I have a collection of crappy LCAs from journals that are shockingly bad, but they still make it into publication in instances, I think, where journals are keen to start publishing in this space and they don't have the editorial or reviewer capacity to do it well. So I would say in general, the literature is sound, but there are some really poor bits out there that can muddy the waters for us. here's some high-level insights that we can take from LCAs. And I'm specifically not going to draw on any one LCA, but from a recent analysis of many seafood system inventory data sets that was published in 2021. Jessica Geffhart led this piece of work. About half the team was LCA practitioners in seafood and half were not. What I would like to orient you to is, okay, there. So these are all the aquaculture related impacts. And what we have on the y-axis are big species group bins. Up here, this is the greenhouse gas emissions. Look at this, I'm shaking like a leaf. Nitrogen and phosphorus emission contributions, land use in green, water use in blue. The vertical beige band that appears in all of these is poultry. Poultry is, we analyzed in parallel as a reference for these seafood systems. And all of these are aquaculture again, and just for reference, and this is fisheries related and only greenhouse gas emissions because we generally don't have eutrophying emissions or land and water use for fisheries related emissions. But the point I wanted to make here is most seafood systems, this is a really good news story, most seafood systems from a climate change perspective, from eutrophying emissions perspectives, from land and water use, with some exceptions, perform really well compared to the highest performing of the big three terrestrial livestock systems, and that's poultry. If we put beef on here, it would hardly, in some of these graphics, it would be off the graph. So what we're doing here and what we are working towards doing, and that's improving aquaculture systems in very specific ways, that's a wonderful thing. All systems we should continue to work on improving, but know that as a starting point, we're doing pretty well in seafood systems. Another insight from this, and I may have to move slightly. This is an output of this piece of work where we tried to understand the relative effect of a 10% reduction in certain key inputs to the aquaculture system. So the 10% reductions that are illustrated are down here. So FCR is feed conversion ratio for obviously just fed systems. Next to it is soy. Next to that is animal-derived inputs, so livestock inputs. Next to that is fish meal, fish oil. So in terms of the F3 challenges, those vertical columns that you see were under greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water use, nitrogen emissions, and phosphorus emissions. The 10% reduction in FMFO, you see almost no color change related to any of those species groups. Why is that? By reducing by 10% fish meal and fish oil, you need to increase something else in the diet. And those something else's in the diet are also having an impact. In contrast, if we look at 10% reduction in the crop inputs, that's the third bars over from the left in each of those pillars, we see in many cases red hues adjacent to the animal bins on the vertical axis. That's telling us that by reducing crop inputs by 10%, we have to increase either livestock inputs into diets or fish meal and fish oil, and those are coming in often with greater impacts in those impact categories. So we will be making trade-offs when we make substitutions. Sometimes those trade-offs may be positive and sometimes they may be negative. The one thing I would highlight here for anybody who's working in fed aquaculture is the almost universally positive role that exists when you can reduce FCR in any way possible. Better genetics, better animal husbandry, better siting conditions of farms, anything you can do that reduces FCR has positive effects across all of these impact categories and all of these species groups, and that's understandable. This is where I shift, and we pick up on the inspiration of Michael to think about villains. He already introduced us to them. So the parser, the motto, I'll tell you only the side of the story that I want you to hear. Technically, this is not a villain of the modeling system, of the understanding of sustainability. This is a villain that appears innocuous but remains dangerous. It's not being clear and speaking at cross purposes when we have a conversation about the sustainability of a system. If my focus is entirely on reducing dependence on aquatic resources, and Michael's focus is on greenhouse gas emissions, but we both just say sustainability, we actually may be motivated, we clearly are motivated differently, and moving systems in different directions. This can profoundly muddy our understanding and the waters. Here's an example that we came up with. Land-based recirculating aquaculture systems may be an excellent way to avoid parasite transmission to wild populations, to local ecosystem disruptions from net pens through benthic loading. It may do all those things really well, but if you don't pay attention to where they're located and what electricity grid they're drawing from and what other fuel inputs are going in, you are likely driving up climate change impacts enormously. The quick pick. Choose fast to choose wrong. Michael, I think, made a really great observation. This is one that preys upon sort of a Kahneman-like thinking fast, thinking slow. If any of you are familiar with Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist and Nobel Prize winner. This villain preys on our suppositions, comfortable truisms, messagings from peers, confirmation, confirming that what we know to be sustainable, despite robust evidence often to the contrary. So I'm going to do something that is dangerous right now. I'm going to ask for a show of hands. Who thinks that pasture-reared beef has lower climate impacts than confinement-reared beef? Nobody? So that means all of you are... So how many people think that confinement-reared beef, so animals after the cow-calf stage go into confinement, are fed up to slaughter weight before going out, that the confinement-reared beef has higher impacts than pasture-reared beef? How many people think that's the case? Wow, and most of you have no idea. That's a novel thing for me. Okay, in a university, usually students will go, oh, it's pasturing. The lowest climate impact beef, with some very minor exceptions, are confinement finished beef systems. Despite the mountains of online rhetoric and feel-good stories that you get around pastured beef. Climate impacts of organic versus conventional crop production. Is organic crop production resulting in lower climate impacts? How many people say yes? And what about conventional? Conventional, gosh, all right. So we have a few more people that conventional is lower climate. That is generally the case from the data. There are some exceptional systems that you will find in cropping systems where an organic system will have a lower greenhouse gas emission, let's say, than conventional ag, but for the most part, conventional ag is higher performing. Local versus distal sourcing. This is far more context specific, depends on non-transport related impacts and how you are moving things around. I live in Nova Scotia. The farm salmon that I can buy locally, I would have lower impacts buying Alaskan wild-caught salmon that was frozen and trucked to me than I would be having locally farmed salmon. If it was air freighted to Nova Scotia, it would be a disaster. The allocator. This is a horrific picture. I don't know where Michael finds this stuff. So this is definitely a problem of the modeling. This villain goes by many names, appears in different guises, but reveals itself when choices have to be made regarding how a process co-products are assigned impacts. Its tell is when that choice conveniently results in advantaging a vested interest. Really simply, let's say you have a fishery that produces, after processing, fillets and a whole pile of fish heads, racks, and guts. And now if those racks and guts are all being disposed of, then it's very clear all impacts stay on the fillet that eventually moves through a production system, all impacts of fishing. But if you utilize those racks and you make a fish meal out of it, what is the responsibility? What is the emission impacts of the original fishing operation that should be carried by that ultimate fish meal that's derived from those racks? The LCA guidance documents give us guidance on this. Avoid it when it's possible, ideally on the basis of physical causal relationships, or ultimately, if you cannot do any of that, some relationship between these co-products, fish meal and ultimately fillet, where economic value is the least favored basis. But guess what? Most people that do this want to use economic value. In a situation like this, you could also use the relative mass of those fillets versus racks. You could use the nutritional energy, in the fillets and in the waste materials. And in that case, the nutritional energy in the waste materials may be greater than in the fillets that are heading direct to consumers. But the relative prices are often in the reverse direction. The problem is, if you are a business that is doing an LCA of salmon fillets, you want to maybe pick the energy density of your co-product racks and heads so that more of the responsibility flows to those products. But if you are a fish meal consumer and this modeling is being done, what I see is people advocating for economic allocation so that it diminishes the implications, the climate implications of their product choices. But you can't have these two systems logically operating in parallel using different principles. It's just moving things around to different people. So you need to have a principled basis upon which this occurs and be consistent. Otherwise, and this is going to be increasingly critical, not just for our current substitutions that occur, but also many of our novel fish-free feed substitutes are going to be derived from activities that generate co-products. This is an issue that is never going to go away, and we just have to be disciplined about it. So finally, the Hydra. Beware of unintended consequences. We've heard about some of these earlier in our couple days here. This villain is almost impossible to avoid given various ways it can arise. So affecting reductions, let's say in climate impacts that result in increasing other problems that we can recognize with the way humans are affecting change at global scales. Or affecting reductions in climate impacts in one part of a production system that inadvertently increases impacts elsewhere. So for example, much of the historic replacement of fish meal in salmon diets with plant meals has required increasing not only the number of, but total mass of microingredients in diets. Those microingredients have almost never been assessed in LCAs, but their inclusion rates have gone up. And as people start to look at them, we're finding out that some of them are incredibly impactful. So while a greater inclusion of plant meals may have been driving down macroingredient carbon footprints of a diet, by not attending to those microingredient inputs, we may have been deceiving ourselves as to understanding the benefits. So we just have to be conscious that we seldom do just one thing. I'm about to hand back to Michael. These are the current villains that we chose to highlight, but others lurk around the corner. And frankly, the blindness of our own limitations of knowledge and how we are able to understand them is a problem in and of itself. it's easy to quantify greenhouse gas emissions of burning diesel and producing concrete, but there are sets of emissions that we can recognize, but we don't quantify well. And these are often the biogenic emissions of a lot of our production systems. Emissions, gaseous emissions from pond culture can be huge in certain settings, and we have very, very poor data on understanding that. I'll leave it there.
So a lot of these villains are known knowns, and again, we have to be concerned about the known unknowns. Werewolf actually not one of our villains because we can't use silver bullets on this. This isn't a single, I'm gonna do this one thing and I'm gonna solve every problem. Okay, this is like the supervillains are, it's the Justice League. You gotta have everybody working together towards a solution. So now we're gonna bring up Dianto Kemmerly, sorry. She's the Vice President of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Global Oceans Conservation Program. And she's gonna talk about roads on how we continue to move forward. And she is one of the OGs of the sustainability world. She's been at this for a long time. 25
years. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you. Michael, I'm really happy you had the no silver bullet after the werewolf, because if that was my intro with a werewolf on the screen, I would have been a little paranoid getting up here. I'm not a werewolf. I've been doing this for 25 years, and we're actually celebrating 25 years of Seafood Watch this year. So Monterey Bay Aquarium is about 2 hours south, and we are situated in an old sardine cannery. Actually, I mean, we are operating an aquarium and a conservation organization in an active fishing and aquaculture community. So it really is at the roots of Monterey Bay Aquarium that we work on sustainable fishery and aquaculture issues. When we first started the Seafood Watch program 25 years ago, it's because we did an exhibit on sustainable fisheries and wanting to source from those more environmentally responsible fisheries and aquaculture operations. So we kind of came up with this traffic light system of which fisheries and aquaculture operations were more responsible, which ones had some big issues you should kind of avoid. And at the outset, 25 years ago, we had a standard. We based it on the UNFAO codes of conduct. At that time, they didn't even have one for aquaculture. They just had one for responsible fisheries management. And it was a pretty informal program. We put our lists out at our cafe on site, and they started disappearing. And over the next 5 years, what we saw is that consumers, zoos, aquariums, retailers, food service operators were hungry for information about where they should be sourcing their seafood from, because they didn't want to contribute to more environmental harm. So that's where the sustainable seafood movement was really born. People were craving, sorry for all the puns, but they were craving information. A lot of our early work focused on fisheries. Honestly, the information was more available, and aquaculture as an industry, as you all know, was villainized. So it took Monterey Bay Aquarium and all of our NGO peers over a decade to try to work on the stigma around aquaculture. I think we're making a lot of progress, but because aquaculture is so complex, and these trade-offs that Peter and Michael and all of you have been talking about, and the work is so hard, imagine what it's like for a program like Seafood Watch. Consumers want to walk into a restaurant or they want to walk into a store, and they want to be the quick pick person. That's who they are. That's their villain. Tell me what I can buy. Tell me what I can order with a clean conscience. So that means programs like Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch, and I want to recognize our aquaculture program manager, Tyler Isaac. We are trying to take all of this complicated information and distill it down into a recommendation for our business partners and for our consumers. And just to give you a feel for the scope of this movement in the United States, and I'll just speak to the US, not to Europe right now, or to the Asian markets, about 90% of retailers in the US right now have commitments to source from sustainable fisheries and aquaculture. They're really focused on the environmental sustainability, but they're also not parsing anymore. They're looking at social responsibility and equity as well. So that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. And we hand out, on average, over 2 million of our consumer guides and probably have hundreds of thousands of downloads of our web pages every year. So people still want the information. What information do we look at? You heard Peter just present how complicated and how diverse the quality of these life cycle analyses are. That's just a sub-factor of the data that we look at. So I'm just going to run through a list of when we look at the sustainability of aquaculture, we're looking at availability of data. We're looking at effluent. We're looking at feed. We're looking at habitat impacts. There's 10 different criteria that we look at. And just within the feed criteria, we're looking at the sustainability of the feed ingredients. Are they from wild fish? Are they from alternative sources? We look at the broader global impact of those ingredients. Then we have to develop a scoring methodology that reflects our conservation ethic, but it also has to be practicable. It has to be possible. That is not easy, and we can't do that alone. So when Michael asked me to think about how we move forward with this, the villain of the quick pick is not going away. That's our reality. Consumers and businesses need accessible information if we want them to source from aquaculture operations and not continue to villainize the industry. We have to do better at rewarding better performers, and we have to continue to innovate. Every 4 years, Monterey Bay Aquarium reviews our standards for how we do these assessments and come up with these evaluations. All these 10 criteria, how we score them, how we go through the process. I'm here today because we just kicked off that review phase last week. So I'm asking you all to work with Monterey Bay Aquarium, to work with civil society, to come together and engage in that process. Because if we don't make sure we're capturing the best information available, current best practice, and continue to reward and incentivize better performers, aquaculture as an industry will continue to be stigmatized. And we need aquaculture to feed the world. So with that, I really want to thank you and the meeting organizers for pulling this group together. This innovation and this collaboration is the future. We don't always have to agree, but we have to come to the table. So thank you, Michael, for pulling this together, and thank you for all being here today. Thank you.